Hi, my name is Jim McGuire. I am a professor of integrative biology at the University of California at Berkeley, where I'm also curator for pathology in the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology. I've been invited to discuss a paper that my colleagues and I recently published in the journal PLOS One describing a new species of fanged frog from the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia. And this frog is unique in that it has internal fertilization and females give birth to tadpoles. Now, typical frog reproduction involves external fertilization, so the male will clasp the female around the waist, usually in water, and the female will extrude eggs, and the male deposits sperm directly onto those eggs. And those eggs will develop in the water and eventually hatch into tadpoles. The tadpoles are self-feeding, so they move around, feeding and growing, and eventually they'll metamorphose into froglets. Now, our frog is one of perhaps 10 or 12 species in the world that's known to have internal fertilization. Now, we don't know what the mechanism is for internal fertilization, but somehow the male is able to introduce sperm into the female, and that sperm is then able to fertilize the eggs inside the female's body. Those eggs will develop into tadpoles in the female's oviducts, where she'll carry them around until they're large enough for her to deposit them in small seeps or pools of water along the margins of streams. And ultimately, those tadpoles feed and will grow and eventually metamorphose into froglets, as tadpoles do. So this is a very unusual mode of reproduction in having internal fertilization, and as I said, it's unique in terms of the fact that the females give birth to tadpoles. Now, this is a species that we've been aware of for many years. So even though we just described it just a few weeks ago, my colleague Joko Iskandar, who's the lead author on our paper and one of the most senior herpetologists in the country of Indonesia, he's been aware of this frog from at least since the late 80s, and I've been aware of it since 2001. And we've collected it on numerous occasions during the course of our fieldwork on Sulawesi over this intervening period. Now, the reason why we weren't able to describe the species is because it's part of a very complicated assemblage of frogs that occur on this island. So this isn't the only species of Limnonectes fanged frog on Sulawesi. In fact, we believe there are about 25 species on the island, but only 4 of them have actually been described to science. So there are more than 20 species that we believe still need to be described and given formal scientific names. Now, the reason we haven't been able to apply names to all the species is because many of the species look very similar to one another. And in fact, the new species, Limnonectes larvipartus, that gives birth to tadpoles, otherwise looks like a typical frog. In fact, looks like many of the other species that it occurs with on the island. And indeed, we were really only able to determine that there were so many species on Sulawesi once we were able to marshal DNA sequence data for these frogs after years of sampling across the island. And what we've discovered is that there are many cryptic species, many species that look very similar to one another, but genetics tells us they're not only not the same species, but not necessarily even closely related to one another. And it's not that all of these 25 species on Sulawesi all look identical to one another, because there's also tremendous phenotypic or morphological variation in this assemblage. The smallest species are only about 2 grams in adult size. The largest species are over 700 grams, so 300 times larger. Yet there are many species in the small to medium category, many of which have proven quite difficult to distinguish from one another until quite recently, when we've been able to compare specimens with the DNA sequence data sets that we've been able to collect for hundreds of frogs on Sulawesi. So we are, in terms of future efforts, we're very interested in studying this assemblage of frogs. We're interested in more than just this one species with its tadpole rearing phenotype. We're interested in the entire assemblage because we believe it's in fact an adaptive radiation. And adaptive radiations are quite rare in nature, especially for vertebrate groups. We believe that this group is an adaptive radiation because they exhibit tremendous morphological diversity in terms of body size, because they utilize different microhabitats, and we believe an important axis of variation is in fact the reproductive mode. So we've just described a frog that gives birth to tadpoles. One of the other 4 described species has an unusual reproductive mode, not quite as extreme as our tadpole frog, but it has much smaller clutches than typical frogs have. A typical frog that just releases eggs into water might produce hundreds or even thousands of eggs. This second species, Limnonectes erythuni, has small clutches of eggs that are very well provisioned with yolk by the mother, and the male fertilizes them, presumably externally, and then he guards those eggs on land, and they'll eventually hatch into tadpoles, and then they have to make their way across land, usually by sliding down a muddy bank along a stream into water where they will continue their development. So those are two modes of reproduction. Some of the larger species on Sulawesi actually have more typical frog reproduction, where the male just grips the female and fertilizes the eggs that she releases into water with large clutch sizes. We know that there's at least one and possibly two additional species of fanged frogs on Sulawesi where they have small, well-provisioned clutches of eggs that are guarded by males, but instead of being in leaf litter near a stream, they're actually up in the vegetation on leaves overhanging the water. And the tadpoles, once they hatch, just drop from those leaves into water and continue their development. So we believe that the reproductive mode variation in these frogs is another axis that's important to the adaptive radiation of Limnonectes on Sulawesi. So I'm just going to stop there. And if listeners are interested in learning more about this frog or about this research, there's a link to the publication just below this screen. And thank you for listening.